Hello everyone, welcome to the logic section. Today we're going to continue with the semantics of first order logic, and our focus would be constructing counterexamples. But before we do that, we're going to do a couple of problems where we determine the truth value of a statement on a given interpretation. This is the sort of thing that we did last time. I'm going to just do a quick review of that, and then we move to constructing counterexamples. Okay, so here we have this interpretation at the top, and we are asked to determine the truth value of this sentence on this interpretation. And the first step is to determine what kind of sentence we are dealing with, and notice that we are dealing with an existential. We have this existential, and everything else is in the domain, is in the scope of the existential. And if you remember from the last time, we said that an existential, there is some x is true on an interpretation if and only if ax is true for some value of x, or if there is some object that satisfies ax. Okay, so the question is there any object that satisfies this thing in the box, which is our ax, or whether the thing in the box is true for some value of x. So let's see whether that's the case. We have three values for x on this interpretation, 1, 2, and 3. So the question is whether any of those can satisfy the thing in the box. So let's start with object 1. So let's treat x as referring to object 1. So is the thing in the box true in that case? So that would be fx1 and the negation of lx1, x1. Okay, so fx1 is true because object 1 is in the extension of f here. The circle represents the extension of f. So this is true. This is the first conjunct here. Now L11 is also true because there is an arrow going from 1 to 1. So the arrows represent L, the extension of L. So 1, 1 is in the extension of L, so that's also true. But the negation of it, therefore, the negation of Lx11 is going to be false. And that is enough to make the whole conjunction false. Okay, so object 1 does not satisfy the thing in the box. So now the question is, does object 2 satisfy the thing in the box? So we are going to treat x as referring to object 2. So we will get fx2 and the negation of lx2, x2. Okay, so here we can easily see that fx2 is false because 2 is not in the extension of f, and that makes the whole conjunction false. Okay, so the last object is object 3. Does that satisfy the thing in the box? So let's treat x as referring to object 3. So what we get is going to be fx3 and the negation of lx3, x3. And again, you can see that since 3 is not in the extension of f, this is false, and that is enough to make the whole conjunction false. So there is no object that satisfies the thing in the box. So the existential, which is basically the claim that something satisfies the thing in the box, is going to be false. And it is false because all of these things are false. So here is how you represent or how you demonstrate your reasoning. This is why the existential is false, because all of these things are false. Okay? Sometimes you can determine the truth value just by looking at the interpretation. For example, in this case, the sentence is telling us that there is something that is f, but it does not have the relation L to itself. And if you look at this interpretation, there is only one object that is f. However, that object has the relation L to itself. So, of course, the existential is going to be false. but you need to present your solution, so you need to go through these steps when you're presenting your solution. Okay, let's do one more. So the same interpretation, but this time we have this sentence. And we want to know whether this is true or false. So the first step is to determine what kind of sentence we're dealing with. And notice that we have a universal, and everything else is in the scope of that universal. So we are dealing with a universal statement. And from the last week, you remember that for all x, ax is true on an interpretation if and only if ax is true for every value of x. In other words, if and only if every object in the domain satisfies ax. So here ax is this whole thing in the box, so the question is that whether the thing in the box is true for every value of x. So let's check that. We need to check three values, 1, 2, and 3. So let's treat x as referring to object 1. Okay, what we get is that you eliminate for all x and treat x as referring to object 1. So you get there is some y, L x1y, arrow f x1. So the question is whether this thing is true. And the kind of a statement that we have here is a conditional. This is your main connective. So you need to know the truth value of the antecedent and the truth value of the consequent. So here it is easy to determine the truth value of the consequent. fx1 is true. So the whole conditional is going to be true. We don't need to know the truth value of the antecedent. Okay, so it turns out that object 1 satisfies the thing in the box. But that is not enough to tell us whether the universal is true, because we need to have a case where everything satisfies the thing in the box. So we move to object 2. So we treat x now as referring to object 2. And we want to know whether the thing in the box is true for object 2. So we get lx2y, there is some y lx2y, arrow fx2. Well, again, this is a conditional. So we need to know the truth value of this, and we need to know the truth value of this. fx2 is false because 2 here is not in the extension of f. Okay, that doesn't tell us the truth value of the conditional yet. We need to know the truth value of the antecedent as well. Okay, the antecedent here is an existential. So we want to know what is the truth value of there is some y, lx2y. And to know the truth value of that, the question is whether there is any object that satisfies this thing. Whether this existential is true for some value of y. So let's see if that is the case. So let's treat y as referring to 1. We get lx2y1. Is that true? Well, there is no arrow going from 2 to 1 if you look at this interpretation. So this is going to be false. So object 1 doesn't satisfy the thing in the box here. How about object 2? So let's treat y as referring to 2. So we get lx2 y2. And this is also false because there is no arrow going from 2 to 2, right? Well, does object 3 satisfies it? So let's treat y as referring to 3. And then we get lx2 y3. Is that true? Is there any arrow going from 2 to 3? Well, there is. So that one is going to be true. So there is some object, namely 3, that satisfies this thing in the box, so the existential is going to be true. So here's how you explain it. Since this is true, that makes this existential true. Now we can determine the truth value of the arrow. True to false gives us false. Okay, so remember we were interested in the truth value of this universal. And it turns out that there is some object that fails to satisfy the thing in the box up here. So that is enough to tell us that the universal is going to be false. Right? Because every object needs to satisfy the thing in the box if the universal is going to be true. So since there is some object here that fails to satisfy that, that is enough to tell us that the universal is going to be false. We do not need to check x3. As soon as there is one object that fails to satisfy the universal, you know that it is false. Okay. Now when you're presenting your solution, the crucial part is object 2. So you can leave out object 1 here if you want to from your solution. Also here, the crucial thing is object 3, so you can leave the other two, y1 and y2, from your solution if you want to. Okay. So that's how we determine the truth value of a sentence on a given interpretation. Now let's move to constructing counterexamples. These are a little more challenging problems. So here we are given an invalid argument and we are asked to show that the argument is invalid, right? And we do that by constructing a counterexample that makes the premises true and the conclusion false. Because it follows from the definition of validity that if you have an argument that it is possible to make the premises true and the conclusion false, then the argument is invalid. So that is what we are going to do. Construct a counterexample that makes the premises true and the conclusion false. Okay. Now, here notice that all of the predicates that we have in this argument, F, G, and H, they are one-place predicates. So the interpretation or the counterexample that we are going to make can be presented in a matrix format, right? So let's do that. We start constructing an interpretation in the matrix format and we'll list the predicates F, G, and H. And we always start with only one object in the domain. Our goal is to make the conclusion false and the premises true with only one object. If we succeed, well, we are good. If we failed to make the premises true and conclusion false with one object, then we move to the second object. Okay? And we always start with the conclusion. So our goal is to make the conclusion, namely there is some xgx false, and at the same time we want to make all the premises true. So we want to make there is some x fx or gx true, we also want to make for all x fx arrow not hx true, and we also want to make there is some x hx true. So that's our goal. So the question for us is that can we assign object 1 to these predicates in a way that makes this happen? So we'll start with the conclusion, as I said. So in order to make the conclusion false, notice that here we have an existential. So we need to make sure that nothing satisfies gx. So we need to make sure that gx is false for every value of x. At this point, there is only one value for x, namely 1. So we need to make sure that gx1 is false. How can we do that? Well, very simple. Just make sure that 1 is not in the extension of g. So we put a minus here. And that makes the conclusion false at this point because there is nothing that satisfies gx. Okay, let's move to the premises. Here we want to make this premises true. Okay, again, the first premise is an existential. So we want to make sure that there is something that satisfies fx or gx. So there is some value of x that satisfies fx or gx. And since there is only one object, we need to make sure that that object, namely 1, satisfies fx or gx. Okay, we already know that gx1 is false. So our goal is to make this thing true. So we need to make fx1 true. So we do that by making sure that 1 is in the extension of f. Okay, now since there is something that satisfies fx or gx, the existential is going to be true. Good. So move to the universal. Now you need to make sure that this thing, fx arrow not hx, is true for every value of x. And at this point, there is only one value for x. Right? So make sure that fx1 arrow, the negation of hx1, is true. Okay, on this interpretation, fx1 is true. So we need to make sure that not hx1 is true. So we need to make sure that hx1 is false, right? Because then the negation would be true. So we do that by putting a negative there. And now, as is it the case for now, everything satisfies the formula attached to the universal. So the universal is true. Okay, so far so good. Let's move to the last premise. And the last premise is that there is some x hx. And as you can see, we cannot make it true. Why? Because at this point, there is nothing that satisfies hx. We have only one object, object 1. We treat x as referring to 1. And hx1 is going to be false because h is not, 1 is not in the extension of h. So at this point, this is not true. We failed. Now that we failed, it means that we need to add one more object to the domain. We cannot make it work with only one object. So we need to add one more object. So let's add object 2 to the domain. And now we need to start over. Okay, so we start over, we go to the conclusion. We are trying to make the conclusion false. And the conclusion is an existential. To make it false, we need to make sure that it is false for every value of x. It is false for 1, but now we have a new value for x, namely 2. So we need to make sure that it is false for x2 as well. So we need to make gx2 false, and we do that by making sure that 2 is not in the extension of g. Okay, good. So on this interpretation at this point, the conclusion is false because nothing satisfies it. Good. Now we need to make the premises true. Okay, the first premise is an existential, and there is one object that satisfies it. So the existential is true. We don't need to worry about that. So we don't need to check the value of we don't need to check the truth value of fx or gx for object 2 because that's irrelevant. As long as this is true, the existential is going to be true. So we are good here. So we move to the universal. Now for the universal to be true, fx arrow not hx need to be true for every value of x. It is true for x1, but we need to make sure that it is also true for x2. Okay, so we want to make this true. Okay, there are a number of ways to make this true, but the easiest thing to do here is that we can make the conditional true by just making the antecedent false, right? So let's make fx2 false. And that takes care of the whole conditional. Okay, good. So at this point, the universal is true because everything satisfies it. Now we move to the last thing. We want to make this existential true, so we need to make sure that at least one object satisfies it. Object 1 doesn't satisfy it, so now we try to make object 2 satisfy it. And we can just do that easily by putting a plus here, namely putting 2 in the extension of h. Okay, now since there is something that satisfies the existential, it is going to be true. Okay, so we are good. Now we have a counterexample. We have an interpretation here that makes the conclusion false. Why? Because nothing satisfies the existential, so the conclusion is false. It makes the first premise true because something satisfies it. It makes the second premise, which is a universal, true because everything satisfies the thing that universal is attached to. And it also makes the existential, the last premise, true because there is something, object 2, that satisfies it. Okay? So that's how you present your solution. It's not enough to give us just this counterexample here. You also need to have this solution that explains why this is a counterexample. Okay, so let's move to the second problem. We follow the same procedure for every problem. So this is a good point for you to try to do this problem on your own. So here we have only one premise and we want to construct a counterexample. And again, notice that all the predicates f and g are one-place predicates. So we want to work with a mark matrix representation of an interpretation. So we're going to start here and we're going to put f and g in our matrix. And as always, we start with only one object in the domain. And our goal is to make the conclusion false and the premise true. And as usual, we start with the conclusion. We try to make the conclusion false. There is some x, fx double arrow gx. We want to make this false. And we want to make the premise true. Okay. So, starting with the conclusion. You need to figure out what kind of a statement you are dealing with, and here you're dealing with an existential. Everything is in the scope of the existential. So to make it false, we need to make sure that there is nothing that satisfies the thing in the box. At this point, there is only one value, or there is only one object, object 1. So we treat x as referring to 1, and we get fx1 double arrow gx1, and we want to make sure that this is false. Okay, and we can do that by giving different truth values to f1 and g1. So we can, for example, make f1 true and g1 false. That takes care of the situation here, because true double arrow false gives us false, and we are good for now, because at this point there is one object in the domain and that does not satisfy the existential. So the existential is going to be false. Now we want to make the premise true. So again, you need to determine what kind of a statement you are dealing with. And here it is important to recognize that you are not dealing with a universal. What you are dealing with here is a biconditional. This is your main connective. So in order to make it true, you need to make sure that this part and this part are going to have the same truth value. Okay, so let's see if that is the case. The first part says that everything is f, which is true at this moment. The second part says that everything is g, which is false, right? So the two parts have different truth values. So the premise is going to be false on this interpretation at this point. Okay, so that's why we fail, right? And here it is important that you don't make this mistake. You might think that, well, in order to determine the truth value of this thing, let me do this. Let me see if it is true for x as referring to 1. But this would be a mistake, because you are not dealing with a universal. So you don't need to determine the truth value of this thing given certain values to x. What you're dealing with is a biconditional. So you need to know the truth value of the first part and the second part. And those truth values have nothing to do with this thing here. So if you do this in your solution, you are making a mistake, right? So it is important to treat this statement as a biconditional, because that's what it is. So at this point, we have failed to make the premise true, because these and this part, they have different truth values. So what should we do? Well, we need to add one more object, object 2, and we need to start over. Okay, now that we add one more object, we go back to our conclusion, and we want to make sure that our conclusion is false. So we want to make sure that it is false for every value of x. So now we have x referring to 2, and we need to make sure that it is false for x2 as well. So again, we need to give f2 and g2 different truth values. And this time, we're not going to do the same thing that we did last time, because we're going to end up with the same situation with the premise. So this time we're going to do it differently. See, this time we're going to make this one false and this one true. And that is enough to make this false. And now the conclusion is false, because everything fails to satisfy it. Good. Moving to the premise. So our goal is to make the premise true. And to do that, we need to give for all x fx and for all x gx the same truth values. And as you can see, at this point, they have the same truth values. For all x fx is false on this interpretation. Why? Because object 2 doesn't satisfy f, right? So because fx2 is false. So here is how you need to present your solution. Since fx2 is false, that is enough to make the whole for all x fx false, right? So this is false. And for all x gx is false, because there is an object, namely object 1, that does not satisfy gx. So this is enough to make for all x gx false. So this is going to be false. False double LU false gives us true. Okay, excellent. So now here we have an interpretation that makes the conclusion false. Why? Because nothing satisfies the thing in the box, so the conclusion is going to be false. And makes the premise true. Why? Because this biconditional is such that it goes from false to false, so that makes it true. And then we explain why the first part is false here and why the second part is false here. Okay, good. Now let's move to this one. Again, it's a good idea that you pause the video and try this one for yourself. So this one is a little more complicated. It involves more than one quantifier in each statement. But notice that all the predicates are still one place predicates. So we're going to still work with a matrix representation. So here's what we do. The list of predicates, we have f and g. And as always, we start with only one object in the domain. And our goal is to make the conclusion false and the premise true. So the conclusion is a universal. Everything is in the scope of this universal here. So in order to make the conclusion false, we need to make sure that there is at least one thing that fails to satisfy the thing in the box, right? Because a universal is true if and only if everything satisfies the thing in the box. So as long as there is one thing that fails to satisfy the thing in the box, the universal is going to be false. Okay, so that's our goal. We want to make sure that this is false for at least one value of x. Well, at this point there is only one value for x, x1. So let's make sure that the thing in the box is false for that. There is some y, fx1, arrow gy. And our goal is to make this false. Okay, now this sentence itself is an existential. Everything is in the scope of there is some y. So we need to make sure that nothing satisfies the thing in the box. So we need to make sure that it is false for every value of y. So at this point, again, there is only one value for the y. So I need to make sure that fx1 arrow gy1 is false. And to do that, we need to make fx1 true, gy1 false, right? So we put a plus here and a minus here. True to false gives us false. Okay, so we are set. The existential is false because nothing satisfies it. And the universal is false because, again, there is something, namely object 1, that doesn't satisfy this thing in the box. So the conclusion is false at this point. Now we move to the premise. Let's see if this interpretation here can make the premise true. Okay, what kind of a statement is the premise? Well, the premise is an existential. Everything is in the scope of this existential. There is some x. So to make it true, we need to make sure that there is at least one value of x that makes the thing in the box true. Okay, so at this point we have only one value for x, x1. So let's see if that is true. So we have for all y, fx1 arrow gy. and we want to make this true. Now this new thing here itself is a universal. Yeah. So in order to make it true, we need to make sure that the thing in the box here is true for every value of y, right? So y1, so we treat y as referring to 1, we get fx1 arrow g y1, and we want to make this true. But as you can see, on this interpretation, this is false because fx1 is true, gy1 is false, and the whole thing is going to turn out to be false. And that makes the universal false, and that makes the existential false. So we failed. That means that we need to add one more object. Object 2. Now we start over. So we go to the conclusion. Remember that we want to make this universal false, right? So we need to make sure that there's at least one object that makes the thing in the box false. So object 1, we want to make sure that this existential here is false for object 1. Okay, to do that, we need to make sure that there is nothing that satisfies this thing in the box here. So we want to make sure that this is false for every value of y, right? We know that it is false for y1, but now we have y2 as well. So we need to make sure that it is also false for y2. So we get fx1 arrow gy2, and we need to make sure that that is false. Okay, so now fx1 is true because 1 is in the extension of f. Now in order to make the conditional false, we need to make gy2 false. So we can put a minus here. That makes gy2 false. Now this whole thing is false. And now this existential here is false because everything fails to satisfy it, right? Good. And so the universal up here is going to be false because object 1 does not satisfy it, right? We don't know about object 2, right? We don't know whether object 2 satisfies the universal or not, but it doesn't matter because we want to make it false, and as long as there is one object that doesn't satisfy it, the universal is going to be false. So we don't need to check x2, right? We are good. The conclusion is false at this point. Okay, back to the premise. We want to make the premise true, this existential. So there need to be at least one object that satisfies the thing in the box here. Well, we saw that object 1 fails to satisfy it, right? If you remember, since this is false, this universal is going to be false, so object 1 fails to satisfy it. But now we have a new object, object 2. So let's see if object 2 satisfies this existential. So we will get for all y fx2 arrow gy, and we want to make sure that this is true. Okay, now what we have here is a universal for all y, and to make it true, we need to make sure that the thing in the box here is true for every value of y. Okay, so let's start with y1. We need to make sure that this is true for y1. Okay. So we know that gy1 is false. So to make this arrow true, we need to make sure that fx2 is also false. So we put a minus here, and that makes this true. Okay, but remember, we want this thing to be true for every value of y. So we need to now check y2. So what we get is fx2 arrow g y2. Again, since fx2 is false, that is enough, right, to make the whole conditional here false. Sorry, the whole conditional here true. Okay, so the universal is true for every value of y, and that is enough to make it true. Now, this existential up here, we see that there is one object, namely object 2, that satisfies the thing in the box. So that is enough to make this existential true. Okay? So we are set, right? Our premise is true on this interpretation here for the reason I just explained. And our conclusion is false. Why? Because this is a universal and there is an object, namely object 1, that fails to satisfy it. So that is enough to make it false. And now, why is that the object 1 fails to satisfy it? Why is it that this existential is false? Because everything fails to satisfy this thing in the box. Okay? So that's how you need to present your solution. You need to have the interpretation, obviously, but you also need to have these diagrams, right, that explain why the premise is true and the conclusion is false. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So here we have a two-place predicate involved in the argument. So we cannot use matrix representation. We are going to move to diagrams and arrows. So we're going to use arrows to represent R, the extension of R. Okay, but the approach is the same. We start with only one object in the domain, right? So I put 1 here in the domain. And we want to make the conclusion false and the premise true. Okay, so the conclusion is a universal and we want to make it false, so we need to make sure that the thing in the box is false for at least some value of x, right? At this point there is only one value, 1. So we want to make sure that rx1 x1 is false. And in this interpretation that we have here, notice that there is no arrow going from 1 to 1, right? So already R11 is false. Okay, and that is enough to make the universal false. Okay, so we are good with the conclusion. We made it false. Now we move to the premise. Now, the premise is an existential and we want to make it true. So we need to make sure that the thing in the box is true for at least one value of x, right? So at this point, there is only one value for x. So let's see if that is true for this value of x, or if we can make it true. So we eliminate for some x and we get for all y, not r x1y, arrow r x1 x1, right? Now we want to make this one, we are hoping that we can make this one true. And this one is a universal. So you need to make sure that the thing in the box here is true for every value of y, right? Because we're dealing with for all y. So this needs to be true for every value of y. Let's see if that's the case. We have only one value for y. So we get not r x1 y1 arrow r x1 x1. So what's the truth value of that? So we know that r11 is false because there is no arrow going from 1 to 1. Similarly, here again rx1 y1 is basically the same thing as r11. There is no arrow going from 1 to 1, so this is going to be false, which makes the negation of it true. So the arrow here is going from true to false. That makes it false. And now, since the universal here is not true for every object, so the universal is going to be false. So we failed to make the premise true, right? Because at this point, there is nothing that satisfies this object in the box. There is only one thing, 1, and 1 doesn't satisfy the thing in the box. So at this point, the premise is false. Now, what does that mean? Well, we need to add one more object. So we just go ahead and put 2 in our interpretation as well. Okay, now we need to start over. So we go to the conclusion. Our goal is to make the conclusion false. And since this is a universal, and there is one object that fails to satisfy it, this is going to remain false, right? We don't need to check what happens to the thing in the box for x2. This is irrelevant, because as long as there is something that is false, that makes the thing in the box false, the universal is going to be false, right? So we are good. No matter how many objects we add, no matter what relations we add, as long as there is no arrow going from 1 to 1, the conclusion is going to be false. Okay, so we move to the premise. Remember, our goal was to make this existential true. So we need to make it the case that the thing in the box is true for some value of x. We saw that x1 doesn't work. So maybe we can make the thing in the box true for x2. As long as there is some value for x that makes this true, the existential is going to be true. Okay, so the question now is that whether we can do that. So we have for all y, not r x2y, arrow r x2 x2. And we want to make this true. Okay, so this thing here that we are trying to make true is a universal for all y, the thing in the box. So we need to make sure that the thing in the box is true for every value of y. We need to make sure that it is true for y1, and we need to make sure that it is true for y2. Okay, so our goal is to make these two things true. Okay, how could we make these conditionals true? Well, one easy way to do that is that we can make this true if we make the consequent true, right? It doesn't matter what the antecedent is, as long as we make R22 true, this is going to be true. The same thing here. So how could we make R22 true? Well, we just need to have an arrow in our interpretation that goes from 2 to 2, right? Okay, now R22 is true. That makes these two conditionals true. So here is what we have here. The universal for all y, this thing, is going to be true because it is true for every value of y. That makes this true, right? Okay, now this existential here at the top is going to be true because object 2 satisfies this thing in the box. Right? So the premise is true. And we already saw that the conclusion is false. So we are done. We have an interpretation here. This is our interpretation. And this interpretation makes the premise true and the conclusion false. So this is a counterexample. And we are done. Okay, let's do one more. Okay, so here again, we want to make the conclusion false and the premise true. This time we have a mix of one place and two place predicate, so we are going to use diagrams. We cannot use matrix. So we start our interpretation by putting only one object in the domain. And let's see if we can make the premise true and the conclusion false. Now the conclusion is an existential. We are trying to make it false. So we need to make sure that the thing in the box here is false for every value of x. So there is only one value at this point, so let's make sure that it is false for x as 1. So we get fx1 double arrow for all y rx1y. And we want to make this false. Okay, so what kind of a statement is this? This is not a universal, this is a biconditional, right? So to make it false, you need to make sure that this and this have different truth values. So for example, we can make this true, this false, or vice versa. I'm gonna go with this, make this true, this false. So how do you make fx1 true? Well, make sure that object 1 is in the extension of f. And we can show that by drawing a circle around 1 and label it f, right? So here is how you present one place predicates in a diagram. Okay, now we want to make sure that for all y rx1y is false. So let me just write it here. For all y rx1y, and I want to make it false. So now this is a universal. So to make it false, I need to make sure that the thing in the box is false for at least one value of y. So at y1 rx1 y1, we want to make this false. So just to make it false, you just need to make sure that there is no arrow going from 1 to 1, because we use arrow to represent r. And at this point in this interpretation, there is no arrow going from 1 to 1. So r11 is false. That is enough to make the universal false. Okay, so now that the universal is false, true double arrow false gives us false. Okay, we are good. The existential up here is false at this point because nothing satisfies the thing in the box. Okay, moving to the premise, which is a universal, and we want to make it true. So we need to make sure that this thing in the box is true for every value of x. Okay, x1 is the only value, so let's see if it is true. So we get for all y, not fx1 double arrow rx1y or ryx1. Our goal is to make this true. Now, what kind of a statement is this that we are trying to make true? Well, this is an existential, as you can clearly see. So we need to make sure that the thing in the box is true for at least some value of y. At least one value of y. So let's see if it is true at this point. So we treat y as 1, and here's what we get. Okay, now what kind of a statement is this? This is a biconditional. So we need to know the truth value of this part, not fx1, which is false because 1 is f, right? And we need to know the truth value of this one. Okay, R11 is false, right? Because there is no arrow going from 1 to 1. We have the same thing here. This is basically R11. So this is also false, so the whole disjunction is false. So the whole biconditional is going to be false. Sorry, is going to be true. Okay, now, interesting. So the existential is going to be true because the thing in the box is true for some value of y. The universal here is going to be true as well. Why? Because everything satisfies this thing in the box. At this point, there is only one object, 1, and that satisfies this thing in the box. So basically, everything satisfies the thing in the box. So since this is true, the universal is true. And we have already made the existential false, right? Because this is the only thing, object 1, and it fails to satisfy the existential, so the existential is going to be false. That's it. That's the interpretation. On this interpretation here, the premise is true and the conclusion is false. We don't even need to draw arrows in this case. Okay. Of course, there are other interpretations. You might come up with a different interpretation, but this is the simplest one, right? Okay, let's see how we're doing on time. Okay, we're out of time. So let's just stop here and have a good rest of the day.